Following our idea that the best way to learn endings as well as openings is to study the games of the masters, we give two more endings of two rooks and pawns. These endings, as already stated, are not very common, and the author is fortunate in having himself played more of these endings than is generally the case. By carefully comparing and studying the endings already given, examples 56 and 57, with the following, the student no doubt can obtain an idea of the proper method to be followed in such cases. The way of procedure is somewhat similar in all of them. From a game, Capablanca-Kreymborg, in the New York State Championship Tournament of 1910. It is Black's move, and no doubt thinking that drawing such a position, that was all Black played for, would be easy, he contented himself with a waiting policy. Such conduct must always be criticized. It often leads to disaster. The best way to defend such positions is to assume the initiative and keep the opponent on the defensive. The first move is already wrong. There is nothing to gain by this move. Black should play pawn to a5, to be followed by pawn to a4, unless White plays pawn to b3. That would fix the queen's side. After that, he could decide what demonstration he could make with his rooks to keep the opponent's rooks at bay. This move not only prevents pawn to f4, which Black intended, but threatens pawn to b3, followed, after the c-pawn takes b3, check, by the attack with one or both rooks against Black's queen's rook pawn. Rook to f6, probably with the idea of a demonstration on the king's side by rook to g6 and g2. King to d3, rook to a1 should have been played now, in order to force Black to defend with rook to e7. White, however, does not want to disclose his plan at once, and thus awaken Black to the danger of his position. Hence this move, which seems to aim at the disruption of Black's queen's side pawns. This is a mistake. Black is unaware of the danger of his position. He should have played pawn to g5, threatening rook to h6, and, by making this demonstration against White's king's rook pawn, stop the attack against his queen's side pawns, which will now develop. Rook to c7. He could not play king to d6 because pawn to c4 would win at least a pawn. This in itself condemns his last move, king to e6, which has done nothing but make his situation practically hopeless. Pawn to g5. Now forced, but it is a little too late. He could not play the f-file rook to f7 because pawn to f4 would have left his game completely paralyzed. Black now finally awakens to the danger and tries to save the day by the counter-demonstration on the king's side, which he should have started before. Of course, White cannot play rook takes a7 because of rook takes a7, followed by rook to h6, recovering the pawn with advantage. Pawn to g4. Black is now in a very disagreeable position. If he played the g-pawn takes h4, rook takes h4 would leave him in a very awkward situation, as he could not go back with the king, nor could he do much with either rook. He practically would have to play pawn to h6, when White would answer pawn to b4, threatening to win a pawn by pawn to b5, or, if that were not enough, he might play king to d4, to be followed finally by the entry of the king at c5 or e5. The g-pawn takes f3, check. Again, he cannot play pawn to h5 because pawn to f4 would leave him paralyzed. The advance of his king's rook pawn would make White's king's rook pawn safe, and consequently his king's rook would have to retire to f7 to defend the queen's rook pawn. That would make it impossible for his king to go to d7 because of the queen's rook pawn, nor could he advance a single one of his pawns. On the other hand, white would play pawn to b4, threatening to win a pawn by pawn to b5, or he might first play king to d4, and then at the proper time pawn to b5, if there was nothing better. Black, meanwhile, could really do nothing but mark time with one of his rooks. Compare this bottling-up system with the ending in example 57, and it will be seen that it is very similar. Probably wrong. Pawn to b4 at once was the right move. The text move gives black good chances of drawing. This could never have happened had white played pawn to b4, as he could have followed it up by pawn to b5 after black's king to d6. Pawn to h5, not good. Pawn to f4 offered the best chances of winning by force. If then rook to g7, rook to a6 with winning chances. Pawn to h6, black misses his last chance. Pawn to f4 would draw. If then the e-pawn takes f4, the b-file rook to g7, the g-file rook to g7 would have offered greater resistance, but the position is lost in any case. I leave the student to work this out. Rook to e7. Nothing would avail. If rook to g1, rook to a6, and white will win easily. Black is desperate. He sees he can no longer defend his pawns. Black resigns. From the game Capablanca-Janowski, New York National Tournament of 1913. Black's game has the disadvantage of his double queen's-bishop-pawn, which, to make matters worse, he cannot advance, because as soon as black plays pawn to b6, white replies pawn to b4. It is on this fact that white builds his plans. He will stop black's queen's side pawns from advancing, and will then bring his own king to e3. Then, in due time, he will play pawn to d4, and finally pawn to e5, or pawn to g5, thus forcing an exchange of pawns and obtaining in that way a clear passed pawn on the king's file. It will be seen that this plan was carried out during the course of the game, and that white obtained his winning advantage in that way. The play was based throughout on the chance of obtaining a passed pawn on the king's file, with which white expected to win. Pawn to g4, already preparing to play pawn to g5 when the time comes. Pawn to b6. Black wants to play pawn to c5, but white of course prevents it. This king should come to the king's side, where the danger lurks. Pawn to b5. With the object of playing king to b6 and pawn to a5, followed by pawn takes pawn, and thus have an open file for his rook, and be able to make a counter-demonstration on the queen's side in order to stop white's advance on the right. White, however, also prevents this. Rook to d4. Of course, if the b-pawn takes a4, black will have all his pawns on the queen's side disrupted and isolated, and white can easily regain the lost pawn by playing either rook on the queen's rook file. Rook to e5. He still wants to play pawn to c5, but as it is easy to foresee that white will again prevent it, the text move is really a serious loss of time. Black should bring his king over to the other side immediately. The first part of white's strategic plan is now accomplished. Black's pawns on the queen side are fixed for all practical purposes. Rook to e6. If rook takes f5, the g-pawn takes f5 would have given white a very powerful centre. Yet it might have been the best chance for black. The second part of white's strategical plan is now accomplished. It remains to find out if the advantage obtained is sufficient to win. White not only has a passed pawn, but his king is in a commanding position in the centre of the board, ready to support the advance of white's pawns, or, if necessary, to go to c5, or to move to the right wing in case of danger. Besides, white holds the open file with one of his rooks. Altogether, white's position is superior and his chances of winning are excellent. The h-file rook to e6 to prevent pawn to d4. Also, black fears to keep his rook in front of his two king's side pawns, which he may want to utilize later. Pawn to h6. White threatens pawn to h5, which would finally force black to take, and then white would double his rooks against the isolated pawn and win it, or tie up black's rooks completely. The text move, however, only helps white. Therefore, black had nothing better than to hold tight and wait. Rook to e5 would not help much, as white would simply answer rook to f8. Rook takes e5, and whichever rook black took, white would have an easy game. The student should carefully study these variations. King to b7, king to d7 would not help much, but since he made the previous move, he should now be consistent and play it. Black resigns. The winning tactics in all these endings have merely consisted in keeping the opponent's rooks tied to the defense of one or more pawns, leaving my own rooks free for action. This is a general principle which can be equally applied to any part of the game. It means, in general terms, keep freedom of maneuver while hampering your opponent. There is one more thing of great importance, and that is that the winning side has always had a general strategical plan capable of being carried out with the means at his disposal, while often the losing side had no plan at all, but simply moved according to the needs of the moment. We shall now examine an ending of rook, bishop and pawns against rook, knight and pawns, where it will be seen that the rook at times is used in the same way as in the endings already given. From the first game of the Lasker-Marshall Championship match in 1907. In this position, it is black's move. To a beginner, the position may look like a draw, but the advanced player will realize immediately that there are great possibilities for black to win, not only because he has the initiative, but because of white's undeveloped queen side and the fact that a bishop in such a position is better than a knight. It will take some time for white to bring his rook and knight into the fray, and black can utilize it to obtain an advantage. There are two courses open to him. The most evident, and the one that most players would take, is to advance the pawn to c5 and c4 immediately in conjunction with the bishop check at a6 and any other move that might be necessary with the black rook. The other and more subtle course was taken by black. It consists in utilizing his rook in the same way as shown in the previous endings, forcing white to defend something all the time, restricting the action of white's knight and white's rook, while at the same time keeping freedom of action for his own rook and bishop. This forces pawn to b3, which blocks that square for the white knight. Rook to b5, bringing the rook to attack the king's side pawns so as to force the king to that side to defend them, and thus indirectly making more secure the position of black's queen's side pawns. Note that the white knight's sphere of action is very limited, and that after knight to d2, white's own pawns are in his way. This check accomplishes nothing. It merely drives black's king where it wants to go. Consequently, it is a very bad move. Pawn to a3 at once was the best move. Getting ready to shift the attack to the queen's side, where he has the advantage in material and position. Notice how similar are the maneuvers with this rook to those seen in the previous endings. Paralyzing the action of the knight and fixing the whole king's side. White cannot answer knight to f3 because bishop takes f3 followed by king to e5 will win a pawn, on account of the check at f6, which cannot be stopped. Now the king attacks white's pawns, and all will soon be over. Merely to exhaust white's move, which will finally force him to move either the king or the knight. The quickest way to win. White should resign. White resigns. A very good example on black's part of how to conduct such an ending.